This week, Xi Jinping welcomed more than 30 world leaders to China. Headline attendee Vladimir Putin was joined by the leaders of India, of Iran and North Korea, of course, too, on the red carpet, in stark contrast to his continued shunning by much of the West. President Xi had a critique, too, of what he called bloc confrontation and bullying, and it's been interpreted as the clearest sign yet that Beijing remains aligned with Moscow's view on a war it has long been accused of propping up. Meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron and Sir Keir Starmer convened Europe's coalition of the willing in Paris. They continue to preach on the importance of post-war security guarantees. Many in Ukraine say this is irrelevant if Russia won't make peace. So, do these past few days serve as further proof that the world's diplomatic cogs no longer turn at the will of the West? And what does all of this mean for Ukraine?
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
And I'm Lyse Doucet.
And I'm Lucy Hockings. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
So we have to start by talking about what's been happening in China this week, with Xi Jinping welcoming to Beijing not only Vladimir Putin, but also India's Narendra Modi. And who could forget, of course, Kim Jong-un, who was also there from North Korea. Someone who very clearly wasn't there, though, was Donald Trump. And that is the theme of our first question today. It comes via our YouTube comments from an account called Living Memories, who asked this. Why do the West always freak out whenever other world leaders are meeting without them? NATO and the EU meet all the time. Lyse, why does the West freak out?
Well, every time the Europeans or any other regional grouping meets, they don't have a full-blown military parade, and they don't see it as a show of strength. And was clearly a show of power, that proverbial standing shoulder to shoulder. But of course, I suppose you could also say that in the West, if you want to use that phrase, geography is complicated these days, it's a reminder that there is another alliance rising from the East. And part of that alliance is forged on standing up against what they see as a very biased, so-called rules-based order, where the West sets the rules that are good for the West.
What do you make of some of the names that people are coming up with? Axis of Upheaval, Coalition of the Wicked, just a few, that they're anti-NATO, this group.
Well, I don't think that's how they would describe themselves. But I kept thinking, Lucy and Vitaly, what President Trump must be thinking, because his military parade, of course, didn't have the same kind of stands filled. It didn't have the kind of military hardware. It didn't have all the oomph, as he must be thinking, I better have a better military parade next year.
And what was made of it in Russia, Vitaly?
Well, they're overjoyed. They're delighted that Vladimir Putin is out of isolation, is back in the world arena. And the fact is that the vision that the views of this bloc, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and views of NATO and the EU, they couldn't be more different. There's a chasm between them. So whatever ideas one bloc is discussing, they will be very different from what the other bloc would like to see implemented. So let me assure Lucy that people in Moscow or North Korea, they're not huge fans of all those ideas discussed by NATO and the EU. I'm not sure if they're freaking out, but they're no fans at all.
So many questions still coming into us about sanctions in particular, because you might remember that President Trump's latest 2-week deadline for greater Russian concessions involved the threat of what Trump at the time said were massive sanctions, massive being in caps on Truth Social. But now, as we record, that deadline is going to expire tomorrow, Friday the 5th of September. And this next question we've had from Stephen really captures what many of you are asking.
Hello, Ukrainecast. Firstly, why does President Trump not carry out, as promised, secondary tariffs on countries supplying Russia? The second, why doesn't European countries raise tariffs on countries supplying Russia? These are the only way Putin will negotiate is by economic sanctions on the Russian people. Thank you very much.
Stephen, not the only one asking about sanctions as well. So let's just bring in this question too that we've had from David. Is there any insight as to why the Trump administration refuses to ramp up sanctions and tariffs on Russia, particularly in the light of the additional tariffs on India? This seems to be pushing India closer to China and Russia, which is counterintuitive, I would have thought. So firstly on Stephen's question, Vitaly, why does Trump not follow through, do we think, and why don't European countries raise tariffs?
I think it's clear at this stage that there's something that's stopping Donald Trump from doing actual harm to Vladimir Putin's Russia. And I've been thinking long and hard about what it could be. And I can think of two possible reasons. One is that Donald Trump may genuinely like Vladimir Putin and what he stands for. He may have a lot of sympathy for what he perceives as Vladimir Putin's cause. Secondly, he may be afraid of what Vladimir Putin may do should America do something meaningful to harm Russia's interest. What Vladimir Putin may do to the global economy, America's business interests, national interests worldwide. Donald Trump personally, we don't know that. But I think it's clear that so far the overriding principle of Donald Trump's policy when it comes to Russia and Ukraine has been largely do no harm to Russia.
But they do have the option, Lyse, this is the point of secondary sanctions, to sanction other countries. What we're seeing now is clearly India and China, their relationship changing as a result of this.
Yes, and President Trump bristled at a question from a reporter at his latest scrum, where a journalist asked him, why haven't you taken any action? The reporter mentioned the secondary sanctions against India. And President Trump shot back and you said, you call that no action? You haven't seen phase 2 and phase 3 yet, suggesting that he's got more in store. And we began by discussing this summit in China. And it was so noticeable, this images which emerged of a little huddle. Prime Minister Modi of India just full of laughter, and President Putin smiling and looking on, and President Xi obviously so pleased. And this was a message to President Trump. Not only am I not going to stop buying Russian oil, but here I am standing next to President Putin, my dear friend and partner. So this is happening at many different levels. But I think I would agree with Vitaly that President Trump has to try to, in some way, to find a way to keep that relationship. He so cherishes that he can have a face-to-face meeting with a man so powerful as President Putin. But he also knows that he's been criticized for being played by him. So he's repeatedly said he will take action against Russia directly, but never comes up with anything which actually hurts him. And quite frankly, I think you've looked at this in detail, Vitaly. There have been so many sanctions since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They cause some harm, but they're really not making a big dent.
Yeah, and Vitaly, to Stephen's question and point about the Europeans, where are we at with Europe and sanctions?
Yeah, because the oil is the big thing.
Yeah.
That's correct. Between the two of them, China and India are buying almost all of Russia's crude oil. To answer the question on Europe, stopping Russia's attacks on Ukraine has a cost, financial, human, if you dispatch actual soldiers to fight, and also the cost of possible Russian retaliation. So if the European Union imposes more stringent sanctions against Russia, that will cause prices to go up somewhere. That will cause some disruption to trade somewhere. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Does Ukraine matter to us Europeans enough for us to sacrifice our money, our lives to the cause of defending Ukraine? That's the big question.
Okay. There's been some questions coming into us as well, and a lot of talk about security guarantees in recent weeks. Of course, for those discussions to be relevant, there has to be some kind of peace agreement, doesn't there? So this next message is about how we might get to that point.
Hello, Ukrainecast. I'm recording this on behalf of my dad, Martin Beavers, as he has a cough. A possible approach to ending the war in Ukraine would be to hold referendums in the regions occupied by Russian forces. This would tick most boxes and would be hard to argue against by either side. Putin has intimated that ceding these regions to Russia is justified because their populations are mainly Russian and/or Russian-speaking, thereby deserving of the opportunity to become part of Russia. He can hardly object to this being proved one way or the other. Needless to say, such referendums would need to be conducted and closely supervised by the UN, together with observers from both sides. As far as I know, this suggestion has not been discussed in the media, but it should be, even if it is ultimately rejected by logical argument or by the Russian or Ukrainian governments. Thank you.
Very well read there by Martin's daughter. Take us through the counter-arguments, I guess, to what Martin's suggesting.
Okay, the first thing I wanted to say is that speaking the Russian language in Ukraine doesn't mean you like Vladimir Putin or you like his version of Russia. Now, under Vladimir Putin, Russia doesn't really do free and fair elections or referenda. If we were to take a look at how things were organized last March when Vladimir Putin was re-elected again, particularly in the occupied parts of Ukraine, people were forced to cast their votes literally at gunpoint. You didn't have to go to the polling station to cast your vote. The ballot boxes found you, and very often there was a man with a gun with that box. So forget about free and fair campaigning, forget about secrecy of the vote. Speaking the truth about the war is criminalized in Russia. The various laws against, quote unquote, discrediting the Russian armed forces, disrespecting the authorities, spreading deliberately false information about the Russian armed forces. And those laws have been applied to anyone who doesn't want the war to continue. He didn't want the war to start in the first place. And also, millions of Ukrainians have left those areas. Hundreds of thousands of people from Russia came. So will they have a say in what's going on? How do you ensure that any kind of polling process is free and fair? Observers, what kind of power will they have?
So there couldn't be some kind of deal where you could see UN monitors or any kind of people coming in with oversight that had independence?
The UN is where Russia has veto powers at the UN Security Council, right? So Russia will definitely make sure that whoever, theoretically speaking, is deployed to monitor this referendum in Ukraine, they are kind of favorable to Russia. They've said repeatedly, we do not want any foreign troops in Ukraine. So for anyone to have the power to control the election, they will have to have some kind of force, the possibility of use force. That is something that Russia objects to very strongly.
Well, with thanks to Martin and Martin's daughter for that question. Solutions very much on people's minds. Ukraine's future very much on people's minds. Matt from Sydney has been in touch to ask the following question. Putting to the side the question of NATO membership for Ukraine, one potential or long-term solution to this conflict following a peace resolution is to at least integrate the country into EU structures. Russia no doubt objects, but would this be relevant? Surely a stable and prosperous Ukraine integrated into Western institutions would be a tremendous advance and even an advertisement to those supporters of liberalism that might still exist in Russia. Lyse.
Yes, well, President Putin was asked about this week, and he said he's never objected to Ukraine joining the European Union. And in fact, Vitaly, you'll remember, it was more than a year ago where Western countries, seeing that joining NATO was such a red line for President Putin, they said, join the EU, take it as a win, go for that as your objective. And so Ukraine in December in 2023 began what's called the accession process for the EU. I think there are now 9 countries that are aiming to join the European Union. Of course, there are many conditions, even though there's a lot of goodwill. Many countries would want Ukraine to join the European Union. But of course, it could mean more money for Ukraine. It could mean more symbolism, but it wouldn't help protect Ukraine. It is all about security, security, security. And for Ukraine, For President Zelensky, it would be seen as, am I right, the consolation prize?
Yeah.
It's important, but
It's
not
important,
enough.
but you're absolutely
Not
right.
enough.
It's not going to defend Ukraine.
And some of the conditions are pretty big that the EU
Yes.
puts in place. I mean,
Corruption.
tackling corruption would be
Yes.
a
Oh,
big
yeah.
one.
It's a big task for Ukraine to resolve.
Yeah.
Setting aside for the moment the question of whether we believe Putin when he says he doesn't
Yes.
mind Ukraine joining the EU, you're absolutely
I
right.
haven't
Liz.
heard him say that before. Is that the first time he said that?
Not really. And the reason why they are not as vocal in their possible opposition to Ukraine joining the EU is, as Lyse says, it's not going to defend Ukraine, while joining NATO is much better at doing that.
Hard power. Yeah.
Oh.
Well, turning away from possible future peace, let's return to the ongoing conflict as well. And we have another question for you.
Hello, Ukrainecast. How far are we away from giving Ukraine more air power from NATO? We had a no-fly zone over Iraq. We stopped the genocide in Bosnia and Kosovo. It's time we did the same for Ukraine. We need to push Russia back to its border. Putin will not go on his own. We need to push him.
Roger, thanks for that question. And Lyse, the answer is?
I remember in the first months of the Ukrainian conflict, the huge billboards in the streets of open up the, or close the skies. Remember that? They wanted a no-fly zone. And that was never going to be given to them because at that point, under President Biden, they did not want to drag a single toe into this war, this gathering war between Russia and Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine has been provided with many aircraft, fighter aircraft, and drones, of course, both supplied but as well more and more manufactured by Ukraine itself. It's just staggering. I mean, this every week and sometimes every day, there was there were hundreds, 500, most of them, the vast majority being brought down by Ukraine, but they get through. And I'll take this moment, actually, if I can, to make a little plug, because I was listening to our dear friend Vitaly voicing a new documentary about two women living in Kharkiv under the attacks, the unrelenting attacks by Russia. It's part of a new program on the BBC, BBC Two, and also iPlayer called Global Eye. And it's it's such a poignant story. But Ukraine is doing the best it can, but it isn't able to push Russia back.
And to answer Roger's question, we're nowhere near the possibility of NATO or the West closing the skies over Ukraine, because the practical implication of that happening would be, okay, Western aircraft get shot at. What does the West do? Fight back? Fire back?
This question hasn't gone away. That's the same
Exactly.
question.
But the big question is, are you prepared to die for the sake of Ukraine?
Even now with, I was saying to you before we started that the coalition of the willing, now they're calling it the coalition of the ready, even though a peace deal is nowhere in sight. Although President Putin talked about a light at the end of the tunnel.
Understandings reached with Donald Trump in Alaska, although we have no idea what they are. Still.
Yeah. Well, now they're calling it the coalition of the ready. So ready for what we'll see.
Ready for what and when. And when it comes to the future of the conflict, we've also had this question in from Mike in Newport about President Putin's plans or potential plans.
Putin's original objective was to take over Ukraine and install a puppet government. It's clear that the resources he expended to gain the territory that he has shows he's miscalculated. The Ukrainian resistance also makes clear that even if they were to take over Ukraine, there is no way Russia could suppress the level of insurgents that will follow. Given his control of the media, why doesn't Putin just make some kind of deal to end the war and then go and tell his people he got everything that he wanted? Will his ego not allow this, or does he not want to look weak in front of his allies?
It's a great question from Mike, isn't it, Vitaly?
It is a great question, and it's true that Kremlin media, they are excellent at distorting reality, bending reality to shape their own vision of how things should be. And if Putin were to suddenly get tired of the war or start thinking, for whatever reason, I don't think there's any reason for him to start thinking that he's not going to win this war, they will try and present whatever happens as victory for Russia. However, if Zelensky stays in power, that is going to be difficult to portray as Russia's victory.
And presumably Russians are getting their news from elsewhere as well. So
they are.
They're not just relying solely on...
I've been arguing all along that consuming and believing Kremlin propaganda is a choice. They still have Telegram. There's no shortage of accounts on Telegram that publish real information, real news. So if the part of Ukraine that's controlled by proper Ukrainian government, not a puppet government, that will be a very obvious defeat for Putin and 25 years of his rule. Ukraine will still be undefeated, democratic, and very, very different from Russia. What he has set out to achieve is to make Ukraine Russia's own and like Russia, maybe like a junior sibling. So if that doesn't happen, in the best case scenario for Vladimir Putin, which is control some Ukrainian territory and control the other part of Ukraine by controlling its politics, social life, and so on and so forth, that is not what he wants. I don't think Vladimir Putin will be able to convince himself even, that's it, that's enough for me. No, he wants all of Ukraine, either territorially speaking, or in terms of controlling it via a puppet regime. And even for Kremlin propaganda, that would be a bit of a tall order.
It's interesting if you want to bring it right back to where we started. I was stunned, or maybe I shouldn't say stunned. It was...
I'm not sure much stuns you anymore, Lyse.
It was distressing to hear President Putin at this summit in China, when he was standing shoulder to shoulder with other world leaders on that side of the world in every which way, said this is a fight against neo-Nazism, that we're joined together to fight neo-Nazi. And that has been his line since the beginning. And so, yes, if he got rid of Zelensky some way, that if he had someone who was more pliant in Kyiv, maybe he could achieve some of his goals. But he keeps repeating that
to
mantra.
say it so brazenly in front of these other world leaders who just sort of nodded.
Just keeps
along.
repeating. They keep repeating it over and over again, and such that hoping that it's eventually everyone will believe it. But they don't, of course.
Well, we started this episode talking about all the meetings and the jovial conversations at times that seem to be had in Beijing. But let's finish by talking about the sort of status quo here in Europe, because we've had a question in from Scott. He's from British Columbia, Lyse's territory in Canada, not your territory, your country.
Yes.
Russia, by all appearances, is at war with NATO. They just blew up a British government building in Kyiv, and all the Brits could do was offer angry tweets. Russia has been conducting sabotage operations in Europe, never mind the cyber attacks. What's it going to take for the EU, for Canada as well, to engage more directly? Are they biding their time to big up their forces? So you've mentioned they're calling themselves the coalition of the ready. But what's their plan at the moment, Lyse?
Well, as Vitaly has already mentioned in this program, Europe, Canada, they don't want to get directly involved. They don't want boots on the ground. They don't want the war to get even worse. Always, President Trump even warned President Zelensky in that showdown in the White House, you're risking World War III. All these countries are imposing sanctions. But yes, it was a reminder when there was that powerful salvo of missiles into central Kyiv last month. It didn't hit, and it didn't seem to be directly targeting the EU headquarters in Kyiv and the nearby British Council. The missiles landed, I think, about 50 meters away, but caused some damage to the buildings. There was an angry rebuke by Ursula von der Leyen of the Commission, but of course, more than 20 people were killed, including, I think, several children. That was of greater consequence. And a residential block was hit. But it's a reminder of that it's so easy to tumble into an accidental war, an accidental escalation. With so many missiles, you could hit something directly that you don't want to hit.
Thanks, Vitaly. Good to see you, Lyse. Thank you. And thanks so much to you for watching. We'll be back next week with another Q&A episode. Goodbye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.